On today's episode of Locked On Wild, what were the games of the year in 2024? I got a few in mind.
Hey, this is Matt Boldy, and you're listening to Locked On Wild.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, we are your team each and every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we will take a look at some of the highlights of 2024 as we get set to ring in the new year here tonight with one final game against the Nashville Predators. We'll take a look at the numbers for the Minnesota Wilds. Kirill Kaprizov leading in pretty much every category to the surprise of no one. And we'll take a look at some of the top games from the past year, as well as some of the big headlines from the past year as well. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild since 2021. And just a reminder for you, tonight, after the game against the Predators, we will have a postcast for you. Since it's New Year's Eve, I'll be up late anyway. We'll ring in the new year with one, but this one will be after the game is done. So we're not doing any sort of a delayed postcast. We'll just do this one once the game is done, and that will be it for 2024. The last postcast and the last episode of the year. I had to use that joke once. So for the Minnesota Wild here, in literally the span of a calendar year, to the shock of no one, 45, 30, and 9. So basically 45 and 39 over the last 84 games. I was surprised to learn that the Wild have an even goals for and goals against. 248 goals for, 248 goals against. Power play of 22.5%. Penalty kills 73.8%. And the numbers were better when John Hynes took over. Obviously took over near the end of November last season when Dean Evason was let go after that listless loss to the Detroit Red Wings, and tried to get the team into a postseason position, but ultimately the Wild fell short, did not make the playoffs, and so this year tried to hit it with just a better mentality, better mindset. And early on in the season, it led to some very impressive results. The Wild at one point had the most points in the entire NHL. Right now, still second in the Central Division and still up there amongst the points leaders, but the pace has started to fall off a little bit. Injuries have started to mount. Kirill Kaprizov's been out of the lineup for a couple of games, and the scoring has gone in the well. So that is something that is going to really have to be a focus in 2025. We'll talk about that more as the show unfolds. But just statistically, some of these numbers are interesting to look at. Kirill Kaprizov played 75 games so far in 2024. He has 56 goals and 56 assists. So you couple the strong finish to the season he had last year. Remember that at the start of the season, it was a really slow start for Kirill, and it took him a while to get going. Missed a few games, and it took him a while to get into form, but once he did, in the John Hynes era, the numbers were right up there amongst the leaders in the entire NHL in terms of his performance. And so it's no surprise, coupled with the hot start in this season, no surprise that his numbers are as video gamey as expected. But there are a lot of gaps in the scoring for the Minnesota Wild over the last calendar year. So Kirill's obviously got the 56 goals, 56 assists, 112 points. Matt Boldy is next. He's got 31 goals and 48 assists in the last 84 games for 79 total points. So you got 112, you got 79, and you got 3 players with 50 points over the last calendar year. Matt Zuccarello has 13 goals, 42 assists, 55 points in 65 games this year. Joel Eriksson-Ek, 20 goals, 32 assists, and 52 points in 65 games. And then Brock Faber with 11 goals, 39 assists, and 50 total points in 84 games in 2024. After that, the scoring starts to really dip. Marco Rossi, though close to that group, with 47 points in 84 games this year, 22 goals, 25 assists. But after that, Hartman is next with 35 points in 76 games. Jonas Brodin with 29 points in 64 games. Jake Middleton has 25 points in 74 games. And down and down the list we go. Just kind of underscores what has become a bit of a problem for the Wild over the course of the last few weeks. Now, from the goalie side of things, over the entirety of 2024, the Minnesota Wild goalies, Filip Gustavsson is 26, 15, and 5 with a 2.68 goals against average and a .910 save percentage. Marc-Andre Fleury, 17, 12, and 17, 12, and 4 with a 2.85 goals against average and an .897 save percentage. And then Jesper Wallstedt, 2 and 3, a 3.44 and an .877 save percentage. So some of those issues from the back end of last season kind of buoying those numbers up here. Obviously, Gus is off to a fantastic start this season, which is the back half of the year. And Fleury's putting up good numbers. Jesper's had a couple of starts so far this year. But it's all about this Minnesota Wild team trying to get back to where they were at the start of the season. And they've had some impressive wins so far this year, but there were a couple of key games in last year's schedule, the back half of last year's schedule, that really caught my eye. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look. I've got 4 games. I've got an honorable mention in my top 3 from this past season, this past year. So we'll take a look at those and recall some of the key points of some of the best games of the year as we continue our 2024 year in review here on today's episode of Locked on Wild. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you weren't paying for twice? Definitely happened to me. I've had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. I was on the job hunt over the summer and had a couple of things that I subscribed to help speed up the process. Guess who forgot to cancel them after the job search was done? Thanks, Rocket Money, for helping take care of that and making that no longer my problem. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/locked-on today. That's rocketmoney.com/locked-on. rocketmoney.com/locked-on. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. For those that were hoping for the live show last night, apologies as still getting Denny's internet ironed out. We'll let you know once it's ready to go and back up and running, and we'll get the show rescheduled for you so that we can bring that to you here on YouTube. So just stay tuned, and once everything is back up and running, we'll let you know. And then, reminder, postcast tonight. We got you covered since tomorrow is New Year's Day. We'll have you covered for a postcast tonight, breaking down the action against the very bad Nashville Predators. Who knows what could happen? So let's get to some of the exciting games from this past calendar year. And I'm going to start with one that featured, the game itself was kind of nondescript, but it featured something that is such a statistical oddity. It has only ever happened 15 times in the entirety of the NHL. I, of course, am talking about the goalie goal game. Filip Gustavsson scoring on an empty netter against the St. Louis Blues, a game the Wild won earlier this year by a score of 4-1. And the game itself, Wild got off to a 3-0 lead. They score in the first. Ryan Hartman gets a power play goal. Jakub Lauko scores shorthanded. And Marco Rossi scores right away in the third to make it 3-0. The Blues get one back, and then they're going on the extra attacker in the final couple of minutes. And if we remember the story and how it played out, Marc-Andre Fleury actually kind of coaxed Filip Gustavsson in to taking a shot at the opposing net. The Wild had a 2-goal lead, and so Fleury said, "You're going to go for it, right?" And Gustavsson said, "Maybe I should." And he does. He lasers it down. The team mobs him, and it was the start of what was a really fun first portion of the season. Really, up until probably the 32-33 game mark, the Wild just they were in cruise control. They were winning a ton of games, great defense, great goaltending, and getting timely scoring pretty much at will for a large part of the early portion of the season. And so that was just one of those fun moments. We've talked in previous episodes about how there weren't a ton of really fun games at the end of last season, because every game felt like, okay, now that we won this one, you check the standings and you're still considerably behind the pack in the wild card chase. So there just was pressure every game last year. Is like, okay, you won this one. Well, everybody you were trying to chase won too. So this year, to have something like that you could really enjoy and celebrate as part of the early portion of the season felt really good. And it led to some very good jokes, including Filip Gustavsson suggesting that he should be utilized in the power play. And it was at the time a St. Louis team that you expected the Wild were going to be neck and neck with, battling for a postseason spot. The Blues have fallen off a little bit. They have obviously since fired their head coach. Jim Montgomery is now leading things for the Blues. But they're 10 points back to the Wild right now, and the Wild have a game in hand. They really can't get any traction together. And that was, I think, a good stamp on that game, too, because Jordan Binnington was in net. And so anytime you can do something like that, that's a good way to go. But I put that as an honorable mention because all of the things that happened in these next three games, I think very notable in the stakes of those games. So we're going to start with another game from this year, and it's actually a recent game. The 3-2 overtime win for the Minnesota Wild against the Dallas Stars. No Kirill Kaprizov in the lineup here. And stylistically, this one was not easy to watch because Dallas throttled the early part of the game. They really had whatever they wanted in the first and the second periods. And then all of a sudden, it's as if a switch flipped and the Minnesota Wild just said, that's enough. We're tired of losing to this Dallas team. They did not beat Dallas at all last year. And it was just a pretty gross stretch against the Stars, stemming all the way back to the postseason from 2021-2022. A lot of games that the Wild had early leads and they squandered, and it just has become a pretty lopsided series between these two teams. And Brock Faber with the iconic wraparound goal in overtime, 35 seconds into OT. He gets the nice feed from Matt Boldy, skates past, I don't even know defensively who it was. I think it was Thomas Harley for the Stars. And Jake Ottinger plays the puck, to the left side of the crease, but is out of position, and Faber just slams it home on the back end. Lots of celebrating. That was a game, too, that going in, you didn't feel like the Wild really had a chance in it. And they rallied together. And this was on the heels of the Stars getting fined for having an optional practice on the 26th, which is a huge no-no, courtesy of the collective bargaining agreement. So that is, I think, one of the standout games for the Minnesota Wild this year, because they faced a multi-goal deficit in the third period. And they were able to, halfway through the third period even, and they were still able to rally to tie and came away with a win in OT, courtesy of Brock Faber. So those are two games that stand out from this year. There are a couple of games that stand out from last year too, including John Hynes putting all the chips into the middle of the table. The Nashville Predators game. This was back on March 10th. It was a 2:30 afternoon game. The Minnesota Wilds were tied up. They had a 3-2 lead going into the third period. About midway through the third, Ryan Hartman scored to make it 3-2. Final couple of minutes of the game, the Predators get a power play. Ryan O'Reilly scores. That's all he does against the Wild. To tie it up at 3-3, the game goes to overtime. But the Wild need to they need to really get both points in this game. So what does John Hynes do? He elects to not leave it up to chance, leave it up to a shootout, or anything like that. He elects to take the game into his own hands and pulls Marc-Andre Fleury in overtime. He goes with a 4-forward lineup, including Matt Boldy, Kirill Kaprizov, Matt Zuccarello, and I believe Joel Eriksson-Ek was on the ice too. He goes with the 4-forward lineup because he says, dang it, we're winning this thing right now. We are going to win this and not allow Nashville an opportunity to potentially steal one from us here. And it worked. Boldy gets the goal. And the Wild shock the Predators in OT. I remember this game pretty vividly up in the press box. Everybody seeing this play out and wondering, what is John Hynes up to right here? And it was a gamble that worked for the Wild once. They tried it later in the year against the Vegas Golden Knights. And because they gave up an empty netter in OT, they did not get any of the points. They went home empty-handed, even though the game got to OT. So I think the big takeaway from that game was the gamble and the fact that Hynes was willing to lay it all out on the line to try to seal the win, as opposed to just kind of playing for, well, let's just get it to a shootout and see what happens. That was, I think, the thing that I took most from that game was John Hynes is willing to gamble here a little bit, and I like that. Obviously, in the game against Vegas, it didn't work, but you literally win some and you lose some. It was something that I don't think we would have seen from Dean Evason. It was a gamble that was very calculated, and it worked the first time, but just not the second. So that obviously was a very notable game from March the 10th. The Wild were furiously trying to get back into the playoff picture at that point. And that was definitely one of the more exciting games of the season last year, but it was not the most exciting. We'll tell you which one. I think everybody knows which game I'm talking about because it featured just an onslaught of goals. So we will take a look at that game as well as some of the big headlines from 2024 for the Minnesota Wild. That is all on the way as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. And once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Reminder, we got a postcast coming up for you here tonight after the Wild take on the Predators. Hopefully, well, we'll see what happens. We'll have you covered either way. We'll see how this game goes. So looking at some of the best games of the year, I'm talking not this season specifically, the back half of last year to currently this year. I'm talking about the entire 2024 experience. And if there are any games that we have not discussed, let me know in the comments. What was your favorite game of the year for the Minnesota Wild in 2024? Well, mine was this one. February 19th, 2024 at the XL Energy Center. The Minnesota Wild took on the Vancouver Canucks. And this game got on tilt very quickly. It was 5-3 after 2 periods. Filip Gustavsson had been pulled by the Minnesota Wild. And at that point, you get a Matt Zuccarello power play goal with just over 30 seconds to play in the second. That makes it 5-3. And at that point, I remember thinking in my head, okay, that might be one that can shift momentum for the Wild back in their favor. Because at this point in the game, JT Miller already had a hat trick. He already had scored 3 goals in the first 2 periods. Elias Pettersson had scored 1. Ian Cole had the other. But Gus had been chased 5-2 going into the final minute of the second. Zuccarello gets one back. And then what happens in the third? Joel Eriksson scores 29 seconds in on a power play. Kirill Kaprizov scores less than a minute later on a power play. Joel Eriksson scores 20 seconds later on a power play. So you go from down 5-3 to ahead 6-5. Oh, but we're not done. Marco Rossi scores at the 4:48 mark to make it 7-5. Kirill Kaprizov scores at the 5:12 mark to make it 8-5 at that point. And it was 5 Minnesota Wild goals in just over 5 minutes. And if you factor in Matt Zuccarello's goal to start the second period, it was 6 goals in just over a 6-minute span, which is just insane. And it was going on at such a pace that it was hard to keep up. Every time Vancouver went on was called for a penalty, then all of a sudden they get called for another. So the Wild had multiple 5-on-3 opportunities in that first portion of the third period. So you go ahead 8-5 after the Kaprizov goal. Vancouver's not done. Nikita Zadorov and Brock Besser score, and all of a sudden it's 8-7. And you're thinking to yourself, oh boy. Vancouver, with all their offensive firepower last year, just asking for trouble with 2 minutes left and the extra attacker. Well, Jonas Brodin scores an empty netter with just over a minute to play. And then Kaprizov scores an empty netter with 2 seconds left to play in that one. And Joel Eriksson Ek had already completed the hat trick with his second power play goal of that flurry in the third. So there were already hats that had been thrown out on the ice. Kirill Kaprizov's empty netter with 2 seconds left completed the hat trick for him and was the third hat trick of the night. Think about that for a second. Third hat trick of the night goes to Kirill Kaprizov. And all told, the Minnesota Wild come away with a 10-7 goalies optional win for the Minnesota Wild. And the numbers are just insane. 6-point night for Joel Eriksson Ek. 6-point night for Kirill Kaprizov. 4-point night for Matt Boldy and Matt Zuccarello. That group of four just absolutely destroyed the Vancouver Canucks in that game. But on the other side, JT Miller had a 4-point night with 3 goals. Brock Besser scored, as mentioned. He had a 2-point night. Elias Pettersson had a goal. It was a flurry of goals and shots that I don't think I have ever seen. And at the time, it wasn't Thatcher Demko in net for the Canucks, but Casey DeSmith was no slouch. And he had really good numbers against the Minnesota Wild in his career up until that game. But 8 goals allowed in 25 shots, that's going to inflate those numbers a tad. So for me, in terms of the excitement factor, in terms of the quality of the opponent, that was the game of the year for me. It was one where it just looked like, here we go again. Another instance in which this Wild team is getting caved in by a team better than them in the standings. But a span of about 6 minutes between the second and the third periods just changed the whole game, flipped it completely on its head. And the next thing you know, instead of writing about how the Wilds got run out of their own building again, you talk about one of the more improbable games and a 3 hat trick game with 2 by the opponents, or with 2 by the home team, that is. And one of them finished with 2 seconds left to play. So that's my game of the year. Kirill Kaprizov is my player of the year. And as far as the headlines go for the past calendar year, obviously Dean Evason getting relieved of his duties because the goalies could not make a save early on in the season was the biggest. John Hynes coming in, kind of getting the ship back on track, but it was too tall an order for the Wild ultimately to make the playoffs. So it's Dean Evason getting fired as the number 1. The Wild missing the playoffs last year is number 2. And the number 3 headline of the 2024 season, 2024 calendar year, is the Minnesota Wild getting off to one of the best starts in franchise history to start the season, to bounce back from some abysmally bad play last year. Getting fantastic defense, great goaltending, and a Hart Trophy candidate through the first probably 30 games of the season. What a calendar year it's been, to say the least, for the Minnesota Wild. But as Alex frequently says, and this is just a great thing to keep in mind, as we cover this team and we follow this team into 2025 and beyond. The Wild may be stuck in a rut. They may be on an incredible stretch of winning. It's never boring. There's always something going on, whether it be injuries, whether it be crazy performances. There is always something going on with this Minnesota Wild team. And so I say to you, to close things out, have a wonderful new year. Be safe, be smart, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you in 2025. Whatever this may lead to for the Minnesota Wild in 2025 and beyond, I appreciate each and every one of you that tune in on a daily basis. And I'm looking forward to getting things more on track in 2025. Now that things have settled down a little bit. So enjoy your New Year's Eve tonight. We'll have a Locked On Wild postcast for you after the Nashville Predators game. We'll see if maybe we can sneak in a little bit of a preview for you here later this afternoon. But enjoy the rest of your night. We'll see you after the game, and then it'll be on to 2025 after that here on Locked On Wild.